Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Museum of the African Diaspora Online. My name is Elizabeth Gessel, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at the museum in San Francisco. MoAD is a contemporary art museum, and our exhibitions and programming inspire learning through the global lens of the African diaspora. I want to welcome everyone to our final episode for now of African Diaspora Film Club, presented in partnership with Black Public Media, with today's program also co-presented by POV Shorts. And this series features Cornelius Moore, who is a longtime director at California Newsreel, the 55-year-old social issue nonprofit film distribution and production company. He is also an independent film curator specializing in works from and about the Black world. Modeled after a book club, we expect that you will have already viewed the film when you join us for the discussion today. But if you haven't already seen them, please stick around. We just can't guarantee we won't have any spoilers. Because this is our final episode, I do want to take a moment to thank my collaborators on the series. Cornelius Moore and I conceived of the African Diaspora Film Club shortly after lockdown in 2020 and presented our first virtual program together in June of that year, and have since presented 35 episodes of the program, which can all be found on MoAD's YouTube channel. I want to thank Cornelius for his vision, his dedication, and his camaraderie over these years. In January of 2021, Black Public Media became a sponsoring partner of the series, and I want to thank Leslie Fields Cruz for seeing the potential in the partnership, and to the tireless work of Cheryl Fields and Ebony Johnson for bringing the partnership to fruition, as well as their wisdom and joy along the way. I offer my heartfelt gratitude to all of you. Today, we will be discussing two short films, FRESHWATER, directed by Hampton, and Descended from the Promised Land, The Legacy of Black Wall Street, directed by Nailah Jefferson. Hampton is an award-winning filmmaker and writer from Detroit. For 2 decades, her essays and cultural criticism helped shape a generation. Her most recent works include the award-winning short film, FRESHWATER, and Ladies First. Selected works include Treasure from 2015, Finding Justice 2019, It's a Hard Truth, Ain't It 2019, and the Emmy-nominated Surviving R. Kelly, also 2019, which broke ratings records and earned her a Peabody Award. Also in 2019, Hampton was named one of Time 100's most influential people in the world. Nailah Jefferson is a New Orleans-born filmmaker whose work spans fiction and nonfiction. Her debut film, Vanishing Pearls, told the story of the little-known African-American oyster fishing community in Louisiana in the aftermath of the 2010 BP oil spill. It premiered at the Slamdance Film Festival and later aired on Netflix. In 2021, Nailah's short documentary, Descended from a Promised Land, The Legacy of Black Wall Street, screened at the 2021 Doc NYC and Martha's Vineyard Black Film Festival, and in streaming on Black Public Media's Afropop digital shorts series in September 2023. Nailah's second feature documentary, the HBO original, Daniele Luna, Supermodel, premiered on HBO and Max. The film was hailed as one of the best documentaries of 2023 by Vogue magazine. Nailah's most recent film, Commuted, tells the story of Danielle Metz, a woman whose triple life drug sentence was commuted by President Obama after serving 23 years. Commuted premiered at the 2023 New Orleans Film Festival. We will start the discussion today moderated by Cornelius, and we encourage everyone to participate by making comments and submitting questions through the chat or the Q&A box. And finally, please take a moment to type where you're joining us from in the chat, because we love finding the diaspora in our audience. Thank you, and I will turn it over to you, Cornelius.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And 35 programs. I'm amazed that there's been that many. And I really feel glad that and honored to be part of this whole program and be involved with the Museum of the African Diaspora and Black Public Media. So welcome everybody. Good evening or good evening, good afternoon for some of us. And thank you to Hampton and Nailah Jefferson for your participation. Where are you at the moment, if you feel comfortable letting us know, and how you doing? Dream.
Hi, Cornelius. Thank you so much for having me. I am on the internet um, and Planet Earth at the same time, all at once. And just really honored to be here with Nailah. I really love her work. And I'm excited. I have a story about her latest film, but I'm a Danielle Luna, being a Detroit native. Okay, I can't wait to hear it. Oh wait,
Yeah, Nailah, Dream, your audio's going in now. I don't hear you.
Okay, I'll go back to the MacBook speaker. Is that better? Yeah, you sound great.
Right,
Yeah.
so,
I have a story about how her daughter got her name.
Okay, okay. I can't wait to hear it. I too am on planet Earth, the internet. I'm in New Orleans. Yeah, uptown New Orleans to be exact.
okay, great. Thank you for that. So I'm going to begin by asking both of you, what's the genesis of your projects with these films? I'm really glad that we had, I don't think we've really had short films in this series, and I'm finally we're going out with some programs of great short films. So let us know, Dream, first, what's the genesis of Freshwater?
Sure. I just I'm drinking boba tea from a really big straw, and I just got some tapioca balls, but
That's right.
that's how one drinks boba. So I, like y'all, with the African Diaspora Film Club, made Freshwater was conceived during the pandemic. It was also so it was a small film that I could do on my own, with a handful of friends, in my hometown, Detroit, where I one of the places that I live, and it was a healing too. My producer on this film, Invincible, also known as Ill Weaver, amazing organizer, and also film producer, musician, and just really good friend, knew how much 2018 had kind of been hard for me, just being on 3 different films. You kind of, Elizabeth mentioned them at the top of the project when she was introducing me, I mean, at top of the conversation. So in 2019, 3 projects that I worked on came out back to back, January, February, and March. So that means that all of 2018, I was like in production, and with big companies. You know, before that I had done independent films, but here I was engaging HBO for It's a Hard Truth, Ain't It, BET for Finding Justice, and then A&E or Lifetime, and Buna Murray for Surviving R. Kelly. And while it's nice to have projects funded at a particular level, the downside of that is just working, in A&E's case, with a multinational publicly traded company that has demands. And so in addition to like all of those subjects being hard, one was shot inside of a state prison in Indiana, another was shot across the country and dealing with a lot of kind of Black resistance to trauma. And the other, of course, was Surviving R. Kelly. And so all of those subjects were hard. But what was also hard was interfacing with these big companies who were funding these projects. And I wanted smallness. I didn't want 30 notes from people's legal departments. I wanted to remind myself that I was an artist, because all of those films felt like a particular kind of activism, and they were. And so I made a small film that was about memory, first and foremost, flooded basements, and my disappearing Black city. It's kind of the log line for that. And I've been thinking about all of those things for more than a decade. I care very much about climate justice. And when we talk about flooding, we typically talk about the coastal areas. And I have lived and currently live, in addition to Detroit, on both coasts. And I do know that this is an issue, in coastal areas, but it's also an issue in the interior. So we have a swollen Great Lakes and a collapsed kind of infrastructure. And we have basements in the Midwest, which is where Midwesterners kind of store their memories and their ephemera, their family ephemera. And I wanted to look at that almost as a kind of a metaphor for what was happening to the foundation of Detroit, which for the past 60, 75 years has been Black people in the Black community. And that kind of forced displacement, brought about by divestment and a whole bunch of other things that we can talk about later. But those are issues I've been thinking about for a long time. I had an opportunity during the pandemic when it was slow and quiet and small to do a slow, quiet, small film about memory, flooding, and Midwestern basements.
Thank you for that. I think I'm from the Philly area, and everything is in the basement too.
Yeah.
Everything, all the memories. Nailah.
Yeah, I'm from New Orleans and nothing's in the basement.
Okay.
If attics, if it's in the basement, you're in trouble. But no, Dream, I just wanted to say, well, first of all, I'm a big fan, but I love your film, and I love it even more now knowing the story behind it. I'd worked independently for so long, and I finally just worked with a bigger company, and I understand the push to make things a bit more commercial and having to just have beyond your own thoughts in your mind everybody else's opinion and holding that all together, but still making the film your own. But as far as Descendant from the Promised Land, it was commissioned by Transform Films, which is Odyssey Impact now. But they really allowed me to approach it in the way that I wanted to. We were very early on able to get on the same page because we knew it was coming out during the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And we didn't want to tell a story kind of that other people were telling because we just knew it was a lot of material coming out. And so we landed on talking to family members of those who had survived the Tulsa Race Massacre, and really draw a thread from 1921 to 2021, and allow these people a space to reclaim their narrative. For many years, for many generations, family members didn't talk about what happened May 31st, June 1st of 1921 with the Tulsa Race Massacre. They never talked about what they lost. They never talked about the trauma. They never talked about the deaths. So it was kind of a secret within the family. And we just wanted to create a safe space for these people to finally be able to share their stories. And I think any film that I'm working on, because a lot of them are hard subject matters, if we can come out on the other side of it with people having told stories, having to have kind of maybe relived or for the first time visit situations that are difficult, if they can come out of the other side feeling a bit more healed, then I feel like we've done a good job and we've done a service to the people who have opened their hearts and their homes and given us their time. And so that was our goal with this film. And from what the families and the participants have told me, they believe that it's a step to healing and further investigating what happened to their families. Galani, who's in the film, he is the person who's playing the piano in the film. He's an artist, a bassist. He's in a group called The Growth Eternal, but he has since created an immersive art space using the voice of his great grandfather and talking about healing and Tulsa. And so I love that it was able to then spawn something within the people in the film to take their stories themselves and do even more with it, more healing, more education.
And both the films deal with memory and archives and how important those are. And if they're not the archives of, big institutions, they're community archives, they're within us. And so thank you for both for capturing all of that in both places. And I was thinking of both Detroit. Gene, you referred to, you know, the blackness of Detroit, and I wrote to you what Detroit meant to me as not being from there, but you know, Motown and the cars, which you know people in my community had. They only had GM cars. They didn't have any of these Japanese or you know always Buicks and Cadillacs and etc. And also the revolutionary history of Detroit, whether it's Jimmy and Grace Lee Boggs and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and Tulsa, which has, because of the Black Wall Street and the promise for Black people who are migrating from the South of both those places, how insignificant both those cities certainly are in our history and contemporary life. I want to sort of follow up on that to ask, what do you think these memories have, what impact do they have for younger generations? What emotions do they touch, and what actions actually do you think your work encourages this generation to take related to that memory and what had happened before?
Well, I've noticed, and we're like almost 30 years into this millennia. We're not at some turning point, but there does seem to be, I think of Thomas Allen Harris's work right now that he's doing around archive. There are a couple of films that I was a part of, the shorts program with POV, that were also looking at archive. There is this, first of all, there's a deep importance in personal archives, in family archives. Obviously, they tell a larger history. They begin to, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, when you're working on a project as an activist, it can kind of be annoying, but you're always asking to tell like a larger story through like a single person or story or family's story, like that hero's journey that we're always asked to do in narrative. But it is true that these individual stories, like my family's story of migration from the South, can also be, it's reflected back to me in Jacob Lawrence's paintings of the migration, in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Warmth of Other Suns, like these kind of larger projects that take on, you know, what it meant when auto companies specifically went to Georgia and Alabama to recruit Black labor to come north to Detroit, and how it was meat companies, meat processing plants, and other kinds of industries in Chicago that targeted, say, Mississippi. And so these migration patterns are formed by a kind of industrial age, you know, a thing that's happening in the US, which actually is part of the reason, you know, we're dealing with the collapse of the planet's lungs in this moment, right? Is the industrial age that, you know, began in Great Britain, and that in some ways we see reaching a kind of peak in Detroit. At the same time, you allude to, you know, Jimmy Boggs, and of course his great work as a labor organizer and revolutionary thinker, along with his partner, Grace Lee Boggs, philosopher, who lived in Detroit until she was 100, and has a legacy that affects my daughter, who was in Detroit summer, you know, when Grace was in her 90s, you know, still organizing, still affecting community, still giving us new ways to think. So there is that both family legacy, and in my film, the photos that I have submersed in water are my father's cousin was the keeper. There's always someone in our family who's the keeper of these treasures. I was so grateful that my family had done these kind of professional photos, you know. I love, you know, the kind of I love to just snap photos, and we all have those. But, in the 40s and the 30s, my family thankfully had the resources, and the idea that documenting and posing for these photos was important, both in Alabama before they left, and then when they arrived in Detroit and Black Bottom, in the segregated area that, before Motown was a huge blues area. Son House, dies in Detroit, in an unmarked grave. Detroit had a musical legacy and scene before Motown, and then, of course, to this day, where some of the most interesting hip hop is happening, and where we, of course, gave the world electronic dance music through techno. So that's like saying a lot about Detroit. And of course, the revolutionary politics, the reason we get a Black city is because we resist oppression through an insurrection in the late 60s. White flight had begun before that with the GI Bill that created suburbs. Detroit, of course, is a city where the big three automakers, did everything they could to discourage public transportation, back to climate, right? And then in the 80s, when my city was the murder capital throughout my high school years, and when I moved to New York, it continued to be for 8 straight years, the murder capital. We had a surveillance from the sky, which meant a deforestation on the ground, right? So we don't have the money that LAPD does to surveil the skies. And that happened in LA too, where they went through neighborhoods in South LA and just kind of, scalped the trees, deforested these inner city blocks in order to surveil people from the sky. So we don't have the kind of fleet of helicopters that the LAPD does in Detroit. But even with our little broke down budget, they managed to, come and chop down all the trees in our neighborhood, right? These are this is how you get to these cities flooding, right? Is that the water has nowhere to go because we've created, what Tupac called concrete jungles, right? And all of those are policy decisions, design decisions that are connected to larger issues of surveillance. And are people in Detroit in this moment fighting back against digital surveillance? Are we at the fronting edge of that, like Tawana Petty and them? Yes, of course we are. Because that's part of our legacy too. I'll stop there. I could say more about Detroit as Haiti, the kind of punishment that we get for being one of the first Black independent spaces in the North, for getting political power early in terms of our Black mayor that resulted after the insurrection and white flight. And the kind of divestment and literal economic kind of sanctions that the suburban areas around us that render Detroit, what it is today, or what, which is, very heavily sanctioned. So that's a lot, but I didn't want to say any of that in my film. I'm saying all of these words, but my film tried to say so little, so if it encourages people to look up any of those histories, Scott Kurashage wrote a really beautiful book, about the 50-year rebellion, about what's been happening in Detroit since 67. But, this wasn't I had already done so much of that kind of didactic, that kind of work in my last 3 projects. So this one wasn't meant to be an essay. It was meant to be a poem.
That's beautiful. I love that. And I could listen all day. I'm just like, this is fascinating.
And Detroit is Haiti. I thought that was, and it's a segue to Tulsa. The idea that we have of Tulsa being and Black Wall Street being a fierce, independent haven for Black people who in hope, and it got destroyed.
Absolutely. I mean, it was targeted for succeeding, for these Black people actually having the gall to go out and think that the American dream was somehow something that they could achieve and be a part of too. Right. And but I want to go back to the subject of archival, because I do think, it's something that is extremely important, but as far as Black archival, there is a deficit. Fortunately, in the story of Tulsa and and Black Wall Street,
we worked with families who were able to collect and keep a lot of their personal archival. And so, I mean, they have that famous photo of Lula Williams in the car with her husband, and the fact that that's the Williams family that we were able to cover in this film. I couldn't believe it when I found out that was them. I was like, what? But yes, that is on their mantle as their family picture, right? And for the rest of us, it's representative of success in Black Wall Street and everything that African-American people were able to achieve just less than 50 years out after the end of slavery. But working on my film Commuted about Danielle Metz here in New Orleans, who was sentenced to triple life in 1992 because of nonviolent drug offenses. She's from this place. Of course, we went through Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and all of her personal family archive was lost. And so what we did is we really had to delve into programs that were starting to collect Black archive, and we were able to use them to supplement her stories. But I just say that to say that the collection and the care for family photos, videos, even just oral testimony is incredibly important. I'm not the documentarian in my family, even though it's my job. It's my sister Jelani, who I think is watching. She's actually in Detroit too. But right, I don't know why I'm like that. Maybe it's because this is my work, and I know the importance, and I'm telling y'all what it is now. But when you talk about the younger people and future generations, I mean, I hope and I would push that they would not only take these photos, but also archive them in such a way so that they are able to be found for their families in the future, by their families in the future, and used however it is, whether it's in a film, in some type of installation, or just as pieces of remembrance to know their ancestors' stories. But yeah, archival, and it's interesting how integral a part it is when you're working with companies and what they want to see, and how they try and use it to validate your story as well. And when we think about things like spatial justice and the fact that we were here and we owned this space, and we were, even if in Tulsa it was only for a moment, they were able to really thrive. But it's kind of putting your stake in the ground and saying, this was mine at one point. And I think it's also a place from which you can fight and try to recover all that was taken and stolen from you, because you have that proof that indeed there was a population of Black people who built and imagined and dreamed and really thrived. And then, of course, we go into the questions of what could it have been had they been allowed to really, if America had kept their promise, right, and allowed them to really partake in the American dream. But I guess it wasn't a promise that was ever made to Black people, so it couldn't have been a promise broken.
The Dream is talked about being from Detroit and rooted in Detroit, and the memories and everything connected to the film and the poetic film that she made. I want to ask you, Nailah, being from New Orleans and approaching Tulsa, what specialness did you bring with you, being a kind of an outsider?
Well, I can't say that the specialists were the people in the film, right? They know more than myself or anybody who could read about their stories in a book could ever know. And then, of course, we were able to uncover that beautiful, important testimony from the Williams family, where the great-grandfather is talking about what happened on the day of the Tulsa Race Massacre. This is Lula Williams' son, and he's telling us how the family was separated, how him and his father tried to defend their home, how it was just legions and legions of white people coming after them, and how eventually he was able to find his mother. And unfortunately, she was never the same after that. But for me, that's more than any expert, could tell you. And we just wanted to give them space to hear their voices, because again, we just felt the power of reclaiming their narrative was more important than even trying to justify kind of or explain away what happened that day. A lot of people will ask why we didn't talk about the white man. I'm sorry, the white woman in the elevator and stepping on her shoe and somebody crying rape. To be honest, I don't know that I believe that story. I think these white people were just tired of seeing Black people thrive, right? It could have been anything. And I feel like sometimes that part of the story is told to justify kind of the actions of all those people who went out and brutalized the Black community. But there is no justification. So we purposefully left that out and just wanted to focus on the success. And again, what was stolen from these communities and how for years and years they weren't able to talk about what happened. And as far as kind of being from New Orleans and the tie there, you know, I grew up in a Black city. We're still Black, hanging on by a thread, but we're still majority Black. And so I was able to see growing up a plethora of Black people doing a number of things. And that was always a great source of pride for me. And so when I told this story, it just came from that place. What if Tulsa could have been able to have this Black community really thriving and I think in New Orleans, so much of what we do is just celebrate our Blackness. There was this quote, everything good in New Orleans is because of Black people. I mean, I don't, you know, some people are mad at that, but I have to say that I agree. But I feel like Tulsa, particularly the Greenwood area, could have said this very same thing had they been there, had they been able to thrive, and they'd still be there today. So that was my tie into the story, just imagining the what could have been, and how big and how huge. I mean, I think the sky was the limit. We all know that. There was no stopping them until ultimately.
Your sister is on. I don't know if you saw.
Oh, what did she say?
Yeah. I'm watching. Thanks for the shout out. Jelani here, living in Detroit, raised in New Orleans.
Yep. She's in Detroit, yeah.
So, Dream, did we get some questions from here, but I'm going to cover them later. But what do you've shown it in Detroit, and I'm curious about people's reactions.
Yeah, I've shown it. It was installed at MoAD, Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. Jovelyn curated a show with my brother Nep Sadhu from Toronto and Sterling Tolles from Detroit, and I was a part of this show, and it was installed at the museum. It can now, of course, be seen on PBS's POV. It was co-released with them in New York Times Op Docs. You know, the museum experience was the one I imagined for it, which is that it was installed and you sat in the dark screening room. You know how it is when you see something. You're always hopeful that when I was at the museum, I was like, oh, are people going to stay the whole 9 minutes and 30 seconds? Or are they going to leave? But you know, it's meant to be experienced. It's a very quiet film. So, I mean, I hope that it generates different discussions. My crew from Detroit created this amazing discussion guide, which can be found on PBS POV, that did some mapping. It's just really beautiful. I was so honored by the work that Morgan Willis and folks did on this discussion guide. In fact, I'll put the link to the guide in the thing because man,
Elizabeth just put it in there.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, just you know, I was just blown away by what Mars, Vanessa, and Morgan did to create this discussion guide to go with it. And so in that way, I mean, yes, we can like radiate out and scale up to these bigger questions around history and environmental justice and Detroit's you know, Black power and pride history. But the film itself is quiet and small. I keep using those words, but it really is meant for you to think about not just where you're physically storing your family ephemera, but this question of like where we put the things that we aren't actively loving on, you know, but we still love, you know, because we have frames in our homes with, you know, photos and artwork, right? And yeah, exactly. And then we have this other like larger archive that gets put in, you know, I know that New Orleans doesn't have basements, but wherever, you know, in basements or attics or storage spaces. And so then, but then that also again becomes a metaphor, like the physical ephemera becomes a metaphor. Like with Detroit, I'm always like, I love New Orleans. I get like a little city envy sometimes when I'm in New Orleans. Sometimes I get this in Chicago. Chicago has never been majority Black like us. There's a real segregation that happens in Chicago. That is the opposite of Detroit, but it's a like fully realized functioning city with like great architecture, right? And there's all that joy of New Orleans. I hate to always be using the word resilience because we shouldn't have to survive things like Katrina, but the joy is, you know, is unstopped, right? And mess-wittable. When it comes to New Orleans. And that's not always the case with Detroit. You know, Detroit is about a lot of like spaces that are abandoned, about neglect, about having had a Black economic and possibly politically like a political power center, and what that looks when you don't divest from things like capitalism, you know, when you just become like a corrupt version of what, you know, white-led cities are doing, right? And then of course, my high school, you know, classmate, Kwame Kilpatrick, you know, goes to jail, famously, Detroit mayor. So like that question of neglect, you know, there's definitely push out. There's definitely, as I talked about earlier, like literal economic embargoes and sanctions that are put on us by our surrounding area, which has one of the 6 largest, like most rich zip codes, like is with one of the suburbs of Detroit, the Birmingham, Bloomfield Hills area. And all of those folks, like when Detroit literally became a Black city post-insurrection, they went and built up farmland rather than do business with a Black mayor. The grocery store, Kroger, you know, which has like outposts dotted all around, you know, everyone famously kind of knows that 8 Mile is one of our borders. On the other side of 8 Mile, you can find grocery stores for decades. And we don't need these these corporations, like, I don't know, the Kroger's multinational, but we don't necessarily need these corporations. There were all of these like kind of independently owned grocery stores, usually not from our community, like Dearborn folks. You know, we have our immigrant merchant class are the Arab refugees that come from the Middle East. Obviously, we have more of those than anywhere else in the country, in the world outside of the Middle East. I'm digressing a lot right now, but I'm saying that we were punished, and as a result, it affected how we, I don't know, there was like that we were punished and sanctioned and boycotted, but then we also are responsible for losing some very precious things that we had that we may not have known were so precious. Like, I really resonate what Nailah said about like growing up in New Orleans and being very proud of being exposed to all kinds of Black people at all kinds of class levels with all kinds of interests, right? Like, I didn't know how precious that was until I went to New York, you know? I'm not saying that New York, obviously Brooklyn has one of the biggest Black did before gentrification, one of the biggest Black populations in the country. But, you know, being on the island of Manhattan, attending NYU Film School in the early 90s, I really felt what it was like to not have power, I mean, I remember how happy New Yorkers were. I voted for him to have David Dinkins in for 4 little old years, you know? And I was like, wow, I never lived in the entire time I lived in Detroit, we had a Black mayor. Now, does having a Black mayor mean that somehow you're going to have progressive or revolutionary like outcomes? No, that's not enough. We know that representation isn't enough, right? But these were things that I took for granted, these conversations. I'm not saying that we didn't have, you know, all kinds of experiences in Detroit, but it was a real breather to not always be dealing with anti-Black racism, which is also the feeling in New Orleans. I'm not saying that there aren't vendors who like close their shops up when Essence comes to town, and that you can experience like anti-Black racism in Black centers, city centers, but it's a lot less than, you know, walking into stores in New York and be like, hurry up and buy or leave, like the kind of experience that I would have as a 19-year-old living in Manhattan.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I went to school at Boston University, and that's when that's when it dawned on me just how privileged I was to come from a Black city. I had friends from everywhere, New York, some people from Boston, just all over. And they had never experienced having a Black teacher, a Black doctor, a Black dentist, any of that. But that's kind of what I grew up with. My world was completely Black. And I think it's the first time that I'd ever experienced any kind of overt racism that I was, you know, overt. I'm sure as a little girl, there were microaggressions that I probably didn't pick up, but it was the first time that I felt like someone kind of didn't speak to me or help me. And it was because of my Blackness. And I felt very much in that moment how protected I was for so much of my life. Yeah.
And I want to make sure that Elizabeth put up the discussion guide for Descendant also. Right. Did you have do you have anything to say about that guide? How much you were involved in it, Nailah?
I can't say that I was 100% involved, but it revolves around, you know, the narrative that we put together for the film. But no, I mean, huge thank you to Odyssey Impact for doing that work, because I think a lot of times as a filmmaker, you're just doing so much of the hard work making the film. And so if you can partner with an organization that then helps you with the impact and the educational component, it just takes a lot off of your plate and allows you to execute it obviously even faster. And especially if you're going through films that are hard and deal with difficult subject matter, it's nice to be able to just kind of like take a breath after and not have to then continue to pile on. So thank you to Transform Films for taking that. They did an absolutely wonderful job, magnificent job of pushing this film and making sure that communities were centered from the start. I think they had a presence in Tulsa a year before deciding to make this film, and started to make connections with people and different community organizers because they didn't want to just do what they thought was happening, just, you know, show up, tell the story and leave. They really wanted to invest. And so, yeah, really proud of the work that they did.
Thank you.
Can I ask Nailah because I was signed up to do a Black Tulsa Wall Street project. It didn't end up happening, partly because there were so many things happening. Was yours around the 100-year anniversary? Were you on the ground at that time when so much was being asked of the descendants of the Tulsa survivors?
It was. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't talking to the same people who were involved in anything else. It was only just because I know it can be so exhausting to continue to tell the story over and over and over again. And we kind of just wanted to also allow new voices to kind of rise up. People knew the story of the Williams family, but there's another family that, the Budnick family, that we profiled in the film as well. And people didn't know about them. And they also didn't realize that after the massacre that families did rebuild. And so people were still on the avenue for a couple more decades. And then because of redlining, other things, they were, you know, completely forced out. But yeah, we wanted to make sure that because I think people can say, okay, that happened in 1921, but then what's happened all these, you know, these other years, like why weren't they able to rebuild, or what policies were put in place to stop them? And so that's why we thought it was important to have a family that was there during the massacre, and then have a family that told about how they were massacred in another way, which was through the political process.
I also want to say just one last thing about Nailah's film is that, yes, learning so much, like with the Budnick family, and because I had started doing research, but
Mhm.
also just as we're headed into award season, one of the films that we're going to see, partly because of the wonderful performance by the sister, I think Lillian James, is going to be Killers of the Flower Moon, which is, of course, about stealing land from indigenous folks, just a state over. But of course, the Tulsa Massacre is like referenced in Killers of the Flower Moon.
Thank you
Yeah.
for pointing that out. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, that whole history of Black people and indigenous people in that area is
No,
just
it's complicated. It's
super
complicated.
complicated.
Yeah, and with what's happening right now in Gaza and conversations about indigeneity and the constant conversation led by NDN, the Sioux and Lakota tribe around land back, and Black folks is recent kind of like the reemergence of the conversation about reparations has been ongoing since slavery, but it complicates the question of this idea of what we're owed on Native land. I've been, I know I just said a lot and I don't really necessarily have time to unpack it. We have 9 minutes left and I know that we have to get to some of these questions, but yeah, I've been thinking a lot about Tulsa, since Gaza and this question of reparations and the ongoing conversation about indigenous folks and land back movements.
Yes.
Mhm.
Very, very, a lot can be said about that, and we should have a program about it at some point. A lot of questions here. One was about, was the negotiating compensation long and back and forth when moving from indie to networks amidst the latest vocal conversations on pay inequity? Is there also a disparity in the doc space to your experience? That's probably a really long answer too.
I'll give a short one. I think that Firelight Media has been doing these great conversations about transforming the doc space. Pay inequity, there's no money in documentaries. I hope folks know that. You're not gonna get rich making documentaries, short or long or feature or series. Surviving R. Kelly, for instance, even though it was on a network, it couldn't be aired twice on Lifetime when it first aired because the brands, people who give you, maxi pads with wings, did not want to be aired next to all this trauma, right? They didn't want their floral deodorant and their maxi pads with wings to be associated with R. Kelly abusing underage girls. So that only ran in its entirety the year it came out, 1.5 times. But that's not my problem. That's A&E's problem. Of course, they sold it to Netflix, but still there's no real money in making docs. But there are other questions around compensation in general, and Firelight and other people are taking on these questions. And this has more to do with the folks who we are asking to perform so much labor, but then also how that comes up against journalistic standards of we didn't, for instance, pay anyone to be interviewed for Surviving R. Kelly. And there are obvious reasons why that shouldn't have happened, so that R. Kelly couldn't say that I paid these women to tell these stories, right? At the same time, they sat down with me for 4, 5, 6 hours at a time and were asked to reopen and relive this particular kind of trauma. And so, I at the time, and I've written about the fact that we didn't have, say, a therapist on set, but we did have lawyers to protect Buena Murray and A&E. And so those kinds of ethical questions are being raised. The pay inequity question is one that the Writers Guild and SAG, those were the recent strikes, and they don't necessarily affect documentary filmmakers. There's not a lot of money in docs. Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Nailah.
Yeah, I was just on a panel that Firelight had at the New
Yeah.
Orleans Film Festival, and it was about narrative justice.
Mm.
And one of those ways, one of the things that we talked about within narrative justice is making sure that the participants are treated well. And what we had to do, not what we had to do, what we wanted to do in the film Commuted that premiered at the New Orleans Film Festival, we wanted to invite Danielle Metz, who is the protagonist of the story, into the process of filmmaking. You know, this is a woman who was sentenced to triple life. She spent 23 years of those of that 23 years of that sentence in prison. She comes back and she's a 49-year-old woman with 2 children who are adults now, but she's starting her life over. And so we tried to figure out ways that we could compensate her without, you know, going against documentary standards. And we didn't really find a way. So what we did was that we made her a consulting producer on the film. And so we gave her work that way. And now that she has the credit and she was able to really just really be involved in the filmmaking process, we were able to justify paying her because she really was doing a job. And I know some people may frown at that. It doesn't matter to me. I feel better as a human being being able to say, okay, this will help you beyond just getting your story out there and beyond possibly helping another young woman, another woman who is incarcerated, things like that. This will be able to really pay dividends for you, and then maybe even open a new avenue. She still calls me. She's like, I have another idea. I'm like, oh, Danielle, we need a break. We'll see what's next. But I think, you know, she's maybe a burgeoning filmmaker now. I'm not sure. But I feel comfortable doing that and talking about that because, you know, we extract so much from these people's lives. And it doesn't have to be in a way that it's monetary, that, you know, that something is given to them. But in this particular case, we thought that was appropriate for Danielle Metz.
Well, I think it's good. I mean, because there is a lot of discussion about documentary film as being extractive, and this is a creative way of doing it and a responsible way of doing it. Thank you for standing strong and tall around that.
Thank
There
you.
is one question. Oh,
I'm answering that.
yeah, no, to
Yeah.
Dream.
Yeah, I'm not answering that. I'm not here to talk about. I think by industry, I'm assuming they mean the music industry.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not answering that. Yeah, there. I mean, I continue to be devastated by patriarchy and misogyny. I don't need the lens of celebrity to be devastated by that. I have misogynist men in every area of my life. Brothers, uncles, cousins, you know, and so it continues to be a devastating thing. It was a lot of labor to do Surviving R. Kelly, and I hope that someone else will take on someone like Puff, because I'm also not a mule who wants to continue to do this labor, and that kind of secondary trauma that comes with doing it. Yeah.
Got you. All right.
There are other industries, though, by the way, and in each of them, you know, during the Me Too movement, you know, we started with actors, but we quickly were talking about people who worked the night shift, janitor, doing janitorial work in Sacramento, who were also being abused and exploited and raped. So I think that this anonymous person is talking about the music industry and probably talking about Puff. And I support Cassie and all survivors. And I hope that someone takes this on. Yeah.
I don't think we have a lot of time, but it's great. I mean, this has been a wonderful dialogue, and Nailah and Dream, I thank you very much for your film and what you've said today, and the knowledge that you put forward here.
Well, thank you, Cornelius and Elizabeth and POV and Black Public Media. My girl Denise is at PBM. I saw Cheryl on here.
I think Leslie wants to come on and say something.
Okay.
Oh, hey, Leslie.
Hey, guys.
Hi, Leslie Fields.
I was like, I'm here tonight, and I just want to say, first, I got to thank Elizabeth and Cornelius for inviting BPM. I heard about it and I was like, "Ooh, Cornelius, I think we might want to join you." And they welcomed us to this program. And I just want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for allowing us to be part of this journey with you. And then, of course, to Nailah and Dream, first of all, just thank you guys for making incredible films. You all are just amazing filmmakers. I love your work. I will continue to champion your work. And thank you for coming and spending the time here with us to talk about your films and your work and your stance on why you do what you do. And that goes to all the filmmakers that have joined us over the past, I guess it's been a year and a half, 2 years. It's been a minute. 2 years. And so that's it. That's all I want to say. It's kind of late here on the East Coast. So, and also thanks to everybody who came and showed up month after month for the film club. It's been great. And a shout out to my crew, Cheryl and Ebony. Thank you.
Yay.
That's it. You should take me off now.
Thank you.
All right, I'll make you go away, but thank you
All
so
right.
much. Thank you for your support and your partnership through this 2.5 year series. So thank you.
And thank you, Nailah, for your work.
I mean, Dream, thank you. I'm a big fan. I didn't want to fan out in the beginning. I'm a huge, huge fan.
I'm a fan of
and
yours.
It's
Yeah.
been great to be in conversation with you. I really was like, oh, I learned so much. Like, this is so interesting. Thank you, Cornelius. Black Public Media was like one of my first internships when I was in, I'm not Black Public Media, I'm sorry. California Newsreel was one of my first internships when I was in college. So, I mean, this is amazing. Full circle. I love it.
Well, thank you all so much. Again, thank you for your incredible work and for this really beautiful conversation. This was definitely, it's bittersweet for me that this series is ending, but this was a beautiful and provocative conversation to go out with. So thank you. I have put a link to a survey in the chat, and it will also pop up when you close your Zoom window, but we would love to hear from you and get your feedback on the program. We also would love for you to come by and see us at MoAD if you're in the Bay Area. We have beautiful exhibitions up and plenty of programming on site, and we will be continuing our virtual programming as well. So check us out on moadsf.org to see what we're doing. And thank you, Cornelius, from the bottom of my heart for doing this with me for the past 2.5 years. It's been amazing.
I
All right.
know.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.